Fantrax Fantasy Football starts of the week for Week 10. Jared Goff faces the Chargers, who allow the most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks and the most passing yards per game this season. Goff is coming off of 2 down fantasy weeks in a row, but in weeks 5 and 6, he finished as the quarterback 4 in both of those games. Some other positives for Goff this season include 2 weeks over 320 passing yards, 2 weeks of 3 passing touchdowns, 3 weeks of 70% plus completion percentage. PlayerProfiler.com also ranked Goff first in accuracy rating, second in true completion percentage, and second in deep ball completion percentage. So we have an efficient quarterback with some passing yard and touchdown upside in a great matchup. I like Goff to be a top 5 play this week. Tony Pollard faces the Giants, who allow the 6th most fantasy points per game to running backs and the 8th most rushing yards per game this season. He's already faced the Giants in Week 1, where he rushed for 70 yards and his only 2 touchdowns of the season. It's been a bit of a disappointing season for Pollard. He's had 3 weeks as a top 12 fantasy running back, but he's also had 4 weeks outside the top 25. Encouraging signs, though, include 3 weeks playing 77% plus of the snaps, ranking top 6 in both targets and receptions, and ranking 2nd in red zone touches. This is going to be a big bounce back week for Pollard. Breece Hall gets the Raiders, who allow the 4th most fantasy points per game to running backs and the 2nd most rushing yards per game this season. It was a down week 9 for Breece Hall, but he was on absolute fire in the 3 games prior. Week 8, he rushed for only 17 yards, but he caught 6 of his 9 targets for 76 yards and a touchdown, 21.3 fantasy points. Week 6, Hall scored a rushing touchdown and caught 5 passes for 54 yards, 20.3 fantasy points. And then in Week 5, he rushed for a season-high 177 yards, scored a touchdown, and he caught 3 passes. After playing under 50% in the opening 4 games, he has played 52+% or more snaps in his last 4. Another running back due for a big bounce-back week in Week 10. Joe Mixon draws the Texans, who allow the 9th most fantasy points per game to running backs this season. Prior to the Week 7 bye, Joe Mixon finished as the running back 14 or worse in all 6 of those games. The last 2 weeks, however, Mixon has finished as the running back 8 and then the running back 9 for fantasy football. 87 rushing yards in Week 8 with a rushing touchdown. Then in Week 9, he scored another rushing touchdown and he caught 5 passes. Jamar Chase is a little banged up. T. Higgins is ruled out. Look for Joe Mixon to have his 3rd consecutive fantasy football scoring week as a top 10 play. DeAndre Hopkins faces the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who allow the 2nd most fantasy points per game to wide receivers and the 2nd most passing yards per game this season. Hopkins had his best week of the season in Week 8, which was Will Levis, the rookie's debut. Hopkins caught 4 of his 6 targets for 128 receiving yards and 3 touchdowns, 34.8 fantasy points. He was the wide receiver 2 that week. Down Week 9 for Hopkins, but what was encouraging was the 11 targets from Will Levis, who threw the ball 39 times, so Tennessee is letting their rookies sling it. Hopkins finished with 140 receiving yards back in Week 5 and is lined up to have another big week in a great matchup. Calvin Ridley faces the 49ers, who allow the 6th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers this season. After scoring under 7 fantasy points in Weeks 6 and 7, Ridley scored 14.3 in Week 9. Ridley caught 6 of 10 targets for 83 receiving yards just last week. We've seen some quality scoring fantasy points out of Calvin Ridley this season, just not consistently. He scored 24.1 fantasy points in Week 1. He scored 20.6 fantasy points in Week 5. 2 games over 100 receiving yards, 2 weeks of double-digit targets, and 5 weeks of 8 or more targets show the potentials to have a good game at any week. In a matchup against the 5-3 49ers, I like Ridley to have to be a big piece of this offense. Michael Pittman Jr. faces the Patriots, who allow the 7th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers and the 10th most passing yards per game this season. Pittman currently ranks 6th in targets. He averages 9.6 per game, which has been solid volume. He also ranks 7th in yards after the catch and 15th in receiving yards with 593. He's only scored 3 touchdowns this season, but he ranks 3rd in red zone targets, so that touchdown rate should go up. Josh Downs, the wide receiver 2, is questionable for the week. The connection with Gardner Minshew is there, and it's a good matchup for Michael Pittman Jr. Dalton Schultz plays the Bengals, who allow the 2nd most fantasy points per game to tight ends this season. The Houston offense was on absolute fire in Week 9, and Dalton Schultz was a big part of that. Schultz finished Week 9 as the tight end 1 for fantasy football. He caught 10 of his 11 targets for 130 receiving yards and a touchdown for 27 fantasy points. Schultz has finished as the tight end 6, tight end 6, tight end 2, tight end 36, and tight end 1 across the last 5 weeks. The connection with CJ Stroud looks solid as well, with 2 of his last 4 games earning double-digit targets from the rookie quarterback. I like Schultz to stay hot in a great matchup this week. Follow us at Fantrax for consistent fantasy football content to help you win your matchups.